After dinner, I heard him knock on her door again. My husband, asking my daughter-in-law for another massage. My son was out of town again. I'd seen it before. The whispers, the closed doors, the fake thank you smiles. That night, I'd had enough. So I switched the massage oil in her drawer with super glue. 30 minutes later, the ambulance was in my driveway. And when they opened that door, even the paramedics couldn't believe what they saw. I'm not proud of what I did, but I don't regret it either, because some betrayals deserve to stick permanently. Don't scroll, this is part 1 of my family revenge story. If you've ever been lied to and stayed silent, you're going to want to hear how this ends. Subscribe before part 2 drops. Because trust me, you don't want to be the last one to find out what happened when the glue dry. I always believed that after 25 years of marriage, there shouldn't be any surprises left. But I was wrong. One night after dinner, I found out that even routine can hide betrayal. It started with something small. My husband Mark began complaining about his stiff shoulders. Every night, he'd sit in the living room, rubbing his neck, sighing louder than necessary, waiting for someone to ask what was wrong. And someone always did. Not me. My daughter-in-law, Eliza. She'd say, "Oh, Dad, let me help," and run to her room to grab her massage oil. The first few times, I thought it was sweet, innocent. She was just being kind. That's what good daughters-in-law do, right? But then my son, Adam, went out of town for work. And suddenly, Mark's neck started hurting every single night. Always around 8:30 p.m., always after dinner, and always when Adam wasn't home. I didn't say anything. At least, not at first. Because women like me, we don't explode. We observe. We collect patterns. I noticed how Mark started wearing cologne before going into her room. How Eliza began locking the door because the dog might run in, she said. How they both emerged later, laughing too softly, acting too normal. One night, I leaned against the hallway wall, listening. There was music playing, not loud, but enough to cover whispers. And every so often, I heard him say her name. Not sweetheart. Not honey. Her name. Like it was something sacred. My stomach turned cold. Still, I smiled when they came out. Eliza gave me a polite nod, her hair a little messy. Mark avoided my eyes. I didn't need proof. I'd seen enough to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the irony. My son had married a woman just like his father, charming, selfish, and dangerously convincing. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I just started planning. The next morning, while everyone was still asleep, I went into Eliza's room. I knew exactly where she kept that bottle, the little glass one with the floral label. Lavender and almond, it said. How fitting. Soft, sweet, deceptive. I picked it up, smelled it, and smiled. Then I emptied it into the sink. Every drop. In its place, I poured something else, a thick, colorless glue that I'd bought months ago for a DIY project. It was industrial grade, meant for wood and metal. If it could hold a bookshelf, it could hold a secret. I wiped the bottle clean, put it back exactly where I found it, and went to make breakfast. By the time Mark came down, I was already humming, flipping pancakes. He kissed my cheek and said, "You're in a good mood today." I smiled. I slept well, and I did for the first time in weeks. That evening, Adam left for another work trip. Eliza waved him goodbye, then went straight to the kitchen to make tea. Mark followed her. They didn't even try to hide it anymore. They laughed about something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I already knew how this night would end. After dinner, Mark stretched dramatically and said, "Think I'll ask Eliza to loosen my shoulders again. Been killing me all day." I looked up from my plate and smiled. Of course, she's good at that. He didn't catch the sarcasm. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. I watched them walk down the hall together. The door closed. Music started. Then silence. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch. Every tick of the clock was delicious. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. At 28 minutes, I heard a scream. High-pitched, panicked. Then another deeper, hoarser. Mark's. I set my glass down, calm as ever. By the time I reached the hallway, there were thuds and frantic banging. "Help!" Eliza's voice cracked. "We're stuck. It's burning." I didn't answer. I just leaned against the wall and waited. When the banging stopped, I called 911. "My husband and daughter-in-law," I said softly. There's been some kind of accident. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the walls of my house. Neighbors peeked through their curtains. And when the paramedics opened the door to Eliza's room, the look on their faces said everything. They were glued together. Literally. I didn't flinch, didn't gasp, just watched as they tried to separate them, their voices a mix of panic and disbelief. Mark kept shouting my name. "Elena, help me, please." I smiled politely. I already did. That night, as they carried them both out on stretchers, one of the paramedics turned to me and whispered, "Ma'am, what happened here?" I met his eyes and said, "Sometimes people get too close for their own good." He didn't ask again. When the ambulance drove off, I stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. The air smelled like glue and karma. I know what you're thinking. Yes, I could have confronted him. I could have screamed, begged, thrown things. But men like Mark don't learn from words. They only learn from consequences. And as the sirens faded into the night, I finally felt free. The next morning, the house smelled like antiseptic and silence. You'd think chaos would leave an echo, but it doesn't. It leaves stillness thick, strange, heavy. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood gossip unfold. Mrs. Henderson from next door was pretending to water her plants, but her eyes were glued to our driveway. Reporters hadn't shown up yet, but I could already see it in her expression. She'd tell the whole street by noon. Let her. Every story needs a storyteller. Inside, the house was too clean. No music, no footsteps, no Mark coughing in the hallway, pretending to be tired. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in years, it sounded like peace. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I already knew who it was. "Mrs. Lane?" the voice asked. "Yes. This is Officer Keaton. Your husband and daughter-in-law are at County General. They're in stable condition, but there's been some, difficulty separating them." I almost laughed. "Difficulty," he said, as if it was just paperwork. "Will they be okay?" I asked, keeping my tone flat. "They'll recover physically," he replied, "but we'll need to ask you a few questions. There's talk of possible tampering." "Of course," I said. "I'll come by later." Then I hung up and stared out the window again. I could have panicked. I could have deleted things, cleaned things, hidden the evidence. But I didn't. Because the truth is, women like me don't get caught. We get underestimated. By noon, the news had already spread. Local couple suffers bizarre accident during home massage. Authorities investigating unusual adhesive incident. They made it sound so medical. So polite. I made myself a sandwich and ate it while watching the report. It felt almost cinematic. Like watching the trailer of a movie I already knew the ending to. Then the doorbell rang. 2 officers. One young, nervous. The other older, polite. "Mrs. Lane, we'd like to ask a few questions," the older one said. "Of course. Come in." They sat at the table, notebooks out. He cleared his throat. "Your husband and daughter-in-law mentioned a massage oil." "Yes, lavender and almond. Eliza's favorite." "And you didn't notice anything unusual about it?" I smiled faintly. "Other than the fact that she was using it on my husband? No." The younger officer looked uncomfortable. He scribbled something, then asked, "Did you ever feel jealous?" Jealous. What a simple word for such a complex betrayal. I met his eyes and said, "No, just disappointed." They didn't stay long. They left with polite smiles and a "we'll be in touch." I closed the door behind them and exhaled slowly. That's the thing about revenge. It doesn't just hurt the guilty. It cleanses the innocent. That evening, I took out my journal. The same one I'd been writing in since the night I started suspecting them. Every date, every time he went into her room, every excuse. Neat handwriting, no emotion, just facts. I tore those pages out, one by one, dropped them into the fireplace, watched them curl, blacken, and disappear. The flames made a soft, crackling sound. Like applause. By the time Adam came home, 2 days later, the whole neighborhood already knew. He walked through the door looking pale, holding his phone tight. "Mom, what happened?" I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times. In some versions, I confessed. In others, I pretended ignorance. But in the one I chose, I simply told the truth edited, of course. "There was an accident," I said. "Your father and Eliza were using her massage oil. Something went wrong." He stared at me, disbelief painted across his face. Are they? Alive, I said quickly, but not together, at least not anymore. He sank onto the couch, head in hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, I knew something was off. That was the moment my heart broke and healed at the same time. He'd seen it too, the lies, the touches, the stolen moments. He just didn't want to believe it. We sat there for a while, the air heavy but honest. He finally looked up. What are you going to do, Mom? Move on, I said. And for once, I meant it. That night, I took a long bath. No music, no wine, just quiet. The kind that feels earned. I thought about Mark lying in a hospital bed, glued to the person he'd betrayed us both with. I wondered if he blamed me, if he was angry, if he finally understood what it feels like to be trapped. I smiled, because I didn't need to know. Karma doesn't send reports, it delivers lessons. Later, as I stood by the mirror, drying my hair, I caught my reflection and paused. For the first time in years, I didn't see a woman waiting for answers. I saw someone who had already written them herself. I whispered, You're free now. And somehow, the mirror whispered back, Finally. The next morning, I got a text. From an unknown number. It read, You didn't have to do this, M. I stared at it for a while, then deleted it. Because no, I didn't have to. I chose to. And that choice, that calm, deliberate act, was the first thing in years that truly belonged to me. As I opened the curtains, sunlight flooded the kitchen. It hit the table where the empty bottle of lavender oil used to sit. I'd thrown it away, of course. But in that light, I could still see its outline, a faint ring where it once stood. Proof that it existed. Proof that I'd ended it. And just like that, the house felt lighter. Not because it was empty, but because it was finally honest. Everyone wanted to know what really happened that night. The neighbors, the nurses, even the pastor's wife who hadn't spoken to me in years. They all called, texted, dropped by with casseroles, not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. In a small town, gossip travels faster than guilt. And this story? It was wildfire. Some said it was an accident. Some whispered that I'd gone crazy. One woman at church even claimed she'd seen me buying glue at the hardware store, which, to be fair, wasn't a lie. But I didn't correct anyone. I just smiled, offered them tea, and said, People do the strangest things for love. That always shut them up. The hospital called a few days later. Mark wanted to see me. Apparently, after 3 days of treatment, they'd finally separated the two of them physically, at least. Emotionally? That's not my problem. At first, I didn't want to go. But something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, said I should. When I walked into his room, he looked smaller. Deflated. Like all his lies had finally leaked out. He tried to smile. You came. I did, I said. He swallowed hard. I made a mistake. I tilted my head. Just one? He didn't answer. His hands were bandaged, his eyes tired. He looked like a man who had finally met his own reflection and didn't like what he saw. Eliza? I asked. He hesitated. She left, said she couldn't face Adam. Good, I said simply. There was silence for a long time. Then he whispered, Did you do it? I met his eyes steady, calm, unblinking. Do what? He blinked first. That told me everything. The doctors said he'd be discharged soon. But the marriage? That was already pronounced dead. I packed his things the next day, not with anger, but precision. Folded his shirts, boxed his cologne, left his wedding ring on top. Not out of sentimentality, just symmetry. He'd taken enough from me. I wanted to give something back. When he came to pick up his things, he stood in the doorway like a stranger. This house feels different, he said softly. It's clean, I replied. He nodded, understanding what I meant. He didn't ask to stay. He just took the box and left. No tears. No scene. Just silence, the most honest goodbye we'd ever had. A week later, Adam came home again, this time for good. He didn't say much about Eliza. Didn't have to. He'd already filed for divorce. We sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the cul-de-sac. He broke the silence first. Mom, everyone's talking. Let them, I said. He smiled sadly. You really don't care, do you? I looked at him, my only child, and said the truth. I cared too much for too long. Now, I just live. He nodded, and for a moment, the weight between us lifted. No more secrets. No more lies. Just peace, the kind you can only earn after losing everything. That weekend, I cleaned Eliza's old room. It smelled like perfume and regret. I opened the windows, stripped the sheets, threw away the massage bottle that the police had returned to me. Evidence released, the tag had said. Funny how karma leaves no fingerprints. Under her nightstand, I found a photo Adam, smiling, arms around her. I stared at it for a while before tossing it in the trash. Because memories, like glue, can hold you back if you let them. Later that night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone in the kitchen. The same kitchen where everything had started. I thought about the woman I used to be, polite, forgiving, always looking for reasons to stay quiet. She was gone now. In her place was someone calmer, someone who knew silence wasn't weakness, it was power. The phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. It was Eliza. Her text read, "You ruined my life." I stared at it for a few seconds, then typed back, "No, sweetheart, you did." Then I blocked her. Because closure doesn't require conversation. The following Sunday, I went to church. People stared, of course. I could feel their whispers brushing against my back, but I walked in anyway, head high, smile soft. When the pastor spoke about forgiveness, I didn't flinch. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the people who don't deserve to be remembered. After the service, Mrs. Henderson caught up with me outside. "I just have to ask," she whispered, leaning in. "Did you really?" I smiled and interrupted. "Do you want to know the truth, or do you just want a story?" She blinked, unsure how to respond. "Because one will set me free," I said, "and the other will keep you entertained." She left speechless. I left peaceful. By the time evening rolled around, the house no longer felt haunted. I lit a candle in the kitchen, turned on some soft jazz, and cooked dinner for one. Steak, medium rare. Mark hated it that way. I savored every bite. Halfway through, I looked up at the empty chair across from me. For years, that space had been filled by lies, sighs, and fake smiles. Now it was just space. And I loved it. I raised my glass and whispered, "To freedom." The candle flickered like it agreed. I know people will keep talking. They'll make their versions, add their drama, change the details. But the truth? The truth is simpler than gossip. He betrayed me. I warned him. He didn't listen. So I let karma do the talking. And if that makes me the villain in their story, then fine, every good story needs one. He came back a week later. Not to the house that chapter was over, but to town. I heard it from the pharmacy clerk before I saw him. "Mark's back," she whispered, sliding my receipt across the counter like it was contraband. I just smiled. Good for him. Apparently, he'd moved into a small rental on the other side of town near the gas station, the one that smells like old coffee and regret. He'd been to the hospital twice, not for injuries this time, but for stress-related symptoms. Translation: guilt doesn't heal as fast as skin. I didn't plan to see him again. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It happened at the grocery store. Of all places, the same aisle where I used to buy his favorite snacks, honey-roasted peanuts, the kind I stopped buying the day he betrayed me. I turned a corner, and there he was. Same face, fewer smiles. Bandages gone, but the damage stayed in his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just stood there, between cereal boxes and canned soup, surrounded by the ghosts of our old life. He broke the silence first. "Elena," he said softly, "you look good." "I am," I replied. He hesitated, then laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do. "I guess you heard people talking." "I did," I said. "They always do." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "I don't expect forgiveness." "Good," I said. "That makes two of us." He blinked, like he hadn't expected me to be that calm. But what could he say? He'd lost everything, his family, his dignity, his little fantasy. All that was left was him, and the sticky reminder of his choices. Later that week, I saw him again, this time in church. He sat in the back, quiet, head bowed. People pretended not to notice, but of course, they did. They whispered behind hymn books, passing judgment like communion wafers. After the service, the pastor approached me. "Mrs. Lane," he said kindly, "Mark's been trying to make amends. He's a broken man." "Then let him stay broken," I said, smiling politely, "because some things aren't meant to be fixed." Some lessons only stick if you stop peeling them apart. By mid-month, the gossip had mellowed into curiosity. People stopped asking me directly, they just watched. At the coffee shop, at the post office, even at the hair salon. They looked at me like I was dangerous, and I didn't mind. There's power in being underestimated, and there's peace in being feared for the right reasons. I started noticing little changes in myself. I laughed louder. I walked slower. I even painted the kitchen warm terracotta, the color of forgiveness and fire. My son, Adam, came by one evening. He looked healthier, lighter somehow. Maybe we both were. We cooked dinner together, just the two of us. At one point, he said quietly, "I saw Dad." I didn't respond. He looked lost. I poured more wine. That's the price of wandering. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. "You're not angry anymore." "No," I said. "I'm something better." "What's that?" "Free." A few days later, I got a letter. Handwritten, unmarked envelope. I knew the handwriting instantly, tight, controlled, familiar. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. "Elena, I've been replaying that night over and over. You always said my lies would stick to me someday. I guess you were right. I'm sorry. M." I read it twice, not because I cared, but because closure deserves acknowledgement. Then I folded it neatly and slid it into the drawer, not in the trash. Not in forgiveness either. Just archival. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a cup of tea. The cicadas hummed, the air smelled like rain. Somewhere in the distance, I heard an ambulance siren. It made me smile, not out of cruelty but irony, because a year ago, that sound meant chaos. Now, it just meant someone else was learning a lesson. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson stopped me on my walk. "You seem happier," she said, almost suspicious. "I am," I replied. "Even after everything?" "Especially after everything," she frowned. "If it were me, I'd never recover." "That's the difference," I said gently. "You'd break. I built something new." She blinked, confused, but didn't ask more. You can't explain peace to people who've never earned it. In the afternoon, I drove past the old house Eliza grew up in. "For sale" sign on the lawn. The curtains gone. Emptiness staring back at me from every window. It didn't make me happy. It just made sense. The universe has a strange way of balancing things. It doesn't rush, but it never forgets. That evening, Adam came home with flowers. "Who are these for?" I asked. "For you," he said. "Why?" He smiled. "Because you taught me that walking away doesn't mean losing." I hugged him then, really hugged him for the first time since the whole mess began. And for once, it didn't feel like we were clinging to pain. It felt like letting go. As night settled, I found myself back in the kitchen again. The glue bottle was long gone, the lavender scent a memory. But when I turned off the lights, the counter still gleamed like it remembered. I whispered into the dark. Sometimes, justice doesn't need a gavel. And the house, quiet and steady, seemed to whisper back. Sometimes, it just needs a woman who's done pretending. I know some people will never understand what I did. They'll call it cruel, insane, vindictive. Maybe it was. But for me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about release. Because once upon a time, I was the woman who cooked, cleaned, smiled through lies. Now, I'm the woman who can sit alone, sip her tea, and not feel lonely. That's growth, the kind they don't teach you in therapy. So yes, he returned. But so did I. The difference? I didn't come back broken. I came back whole. I didn't plan on going public. Honestly, I thought the story would die down like all gossip eventually does. But small towns don't forget easily. And social media? It never forgets at all. It started with a message. A woman named Claire texted me on Facebook. She was a local reporter, the kind who covers charity events, bake sales, and the occasional scandal. She wanted to give me a voice. "Mrs. Lane," she wrote, "people are talking. Would you like to tell your side before someone else does it for you?" At first, I laughed. My side. As if truth was a matter of opinion. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If people were going to tell my story, I might as well be the one holding the pen. So, I said yes. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, recorded, not live. Claire set it up in a quiet cafe downtown, the kind with plants hanging from the ceiling and too much soft jazz. When I arrived, she looked nervous, like she was about to touch something fragile. "Thank you for coming," she said, offering her hand. "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "You haven't heard what I'm going to say." She blinked, unsure whether I was joking. I wasn't. We sat across from each other, two women divided by a microphone and a world of choices. She hit record. "Okay," she said gently. "Let's start from the beginning. Why did you do it?" I smiled. "I didn't." She frowned. "You didn't?" "No," I said calmly. "I didn't do anything. I just stopped protecting people from the consequences of their actions." She leaned in, intrigued. "So you're saying it wasn't revenge?" "Revenge implies anger," I said. This was correction. Her eyebrows lifted. "That's poetic." "Poetry is what's left when the lies are gone," I said. "And I was married to a poet of lies." She laughed nervously, then checked her notes. "Do you regret it?" "No." "Not even after the hospital? The media attention? The judgment?" I shook my head. "Regret is for accidents. I planned this." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The silence between us felt like the calm after a confession, not heavy, but final. She finally asked, "What was going through your mind that night?" "Nothing," I said. "That's the beauty of it. No rage, no panic, just clarity." I told her about the whispers, the music, the locked doors. About the fake smiles, the excuses, the lavender bottle. About the moment I poured the glue and realized that was the first decision in years I'd made entirely for myself. Claire listened without interrupting, her pen motionless on the paper. When I finished, she asked, "Do you think they deserved it?" I smiled again. Deserve is a tricky word, but let's just say it fit. When the interview ended, she sat back, exhaled, and said softly, "People will judge you. They already do. Some will call you cruel. They called me crazy before. At least this time, they'll be right about something." She laughed again, but this time it sounded real, not nervous, but admiring. "You know," she said, "you don't sound like someone who's broken." "That's because I'm not," I said. "I'm rebuilt." The video went live the next day, titled, "The Wife Who Glued Karma Together." Within hours, it spread. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. Half of them called me a monster. The other half called me a hero. Both were wrong. I wasn't either. I was just a woman who'd reached her limit. Adam saw it first. He came by that evening, his phone still open to the video. "Mom," he said carefully, "you went viral." I figured. "You don't care?" I smiled. "Why should I? I've been invisible most of my life. It's nice to finally be seen, even for the wrong reasons." He shook his head, half amused, half worried. "Some people are calling you the glue lady." "Good," I said. "Every small town needs a legend." By the weekend, reporters were knocking on my door. Some wanted follow-ups. Others wanted drama. But all I wanted was quiet. So I made a sign and taped it to my front door. It said, "No interviews, no apologies." That became a story too. The woman who refused to say sorry. And honestly, that one I liked. A few days later, I got an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "You embarrassed me." I didn't need to ask who it was from. I just wrote back, "You glued yourself to the wrong person." Then I tore it up. Because closure isn't a conversation, it's a decision. By the end of that week, people had already moved on. New scandals, new distractions. But my story lingered not because of what happened, but because of what it represented. I'd become a mirror. Every woman saw a piece of herself in me, the silence, the anger, the moment she realized she'd had enough. And every man saw a warning. I didn't post any follow-ups. Didn't explain, defend, or elaborate. I just lived, watered my plants, went on morning walks, bought a new book, smiled at strangers. Sometimes, someone would recognize me. "Are you that woman?" they'd whisper. "Yes," I'd say, "that woman." And they'd nod, not judging, just understanding. A few weeks later, I received a message from Claire, the reporter. "You've started something," she wrote. "Women are writing in, sharing their own stories. They call it the glue effect." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. We're all stuck somewhere until we decide not to be. That night, I opened my window and let the breeze in. It smelled like lavender again. Not the kind that hides guilt, but the kind that means renewal. I looked out at the quiet street, and for the first time, I didn't see the house as a memory of betrayal. But as the stage where I took my life back, I whispered into the dark, sometimes healing looks like revenge in good lighting. And if that makes people uncomfortable, well, they should stop sitting in the dark. I didn't expect it to last this long. Most viral stories fade in days a week, maybe 2. But mine didn't fade. It grew. By the end of the month, the glue lady wasn't just a headline. It was a hashtag, a meme, a symbol, number glue lady, number family revenge story, number she did what we couldn't. At first, I hated it. Then I realized something. They weren't laughing at me. They were cheering. Women, thousands of them, began sharing their own stories under my name. Stories of betrayal, of silence, of being dismissed and gaslit and told to calm down. Some were angry. Some were putic. But all of them ended the same way. I finally took my power back. It was strange, seeing my private pain turn into a public movement. Every morning, I'd open my phone and scroll through hundreds of comments. Some supportive, some cruel. But buried between the noise, there were voices that felt familiar. One woman wrote, "My husband cheated for years. I never had the courage to leave. You did what I never could." Another said, "You didn't just glue them together. You glued us, the women who thought we were alone." I didn't know how to respond. What do you say when strangers start calling you a hero for surviving something you never wanted to experience? Of course, not everyone was kind. Men wrote things too sharp, defensive, venomous. Crazy witch. Man-hater. She belongs in jail. Some even sent threats. I read them all, then deleted them. Because the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And I was finally indifferent. One comment stopped me though. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't flattering either. It just said, "You remind me of my mother. She stayed. You didn't." I think that's why I can breathe now. I read it 3 times, then once more out loud. Because for the first time since everything happened, I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about relief, not just mine, theirs. The women watching, waiting, whispering, what if I fought back too? Claire, the reporter, called again. Her voice was brighter this time. "Elena, your interview hit 500,000 views." "That sounds like a lot of people with opinions," I said. She laughed. "More like a lot of women with gratitude." Then she paused. "There's something else," she said softly. "A publisher reached out. They want you to write a book." I nearly dropped the phone. "A book? About what?" "About truth. About women who refuse to stay quiet. About you." I told her I'd think about it, because part of me still struggled with the idea of being the story. I'd spent so many years living in the background. It felt strange to become the main character. That night, I took a walk through town. The air was crisp, the sky low and gray. People looked at me differently now, not with pity, but with something like respect. Fear, maybe. Or fascination. But for the first time, I didn't mind being seen. At the corner store, the cashier smiled. "You're the lady from the video, right?" "I suppose I am." He hesitated, then said quietly, "My mom watches it every night. She says you gave her courage." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and paid for my milk. But as I walked home, his words stuck to me more than the glue ever had. The next morning, I visited the park where Mark used to jog. The same one where we used to have picnics before the lies, before the distance. There were families there, couples, laughter. Life went on. It always does. I sat on a bench and watched the sunlight filter through the trees. And for the first time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt whole. When I got home, I checked my messages again. Another DM, this one from a woman named Rosa. Her message was long, raw. It began, "I saw your story. It saved me." She went on to say she'd been living in fear, not of infidelity, but of violence. Her husband's temper, his words, his fists. "When I saw what you did," she wrote, "I realized silence kills slower than poison. So I packed my bags. I left. And I'm still alive because of you." I didn't cry often anymore, but I cried then. Not because of guilt, but because of grace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with my tea, reading every message, every story, every confession. Some were heartbreaking. Some were triumphant. But all of them were real. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't before. What I did had been personal, but the impact was collective. It wasn't about glue or betrayal anymore. It was about women reclaiming the narrative. Around midnight, I received one more message. This one didn't have a name. Just 2 words. Thank you. No context. No explanation. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. Because I didn't need to know who it was from. Maybe it was a stranger. Maybe it was Eliza. Maybe, just maybe, it was from the version of myself that finally healed. I closed my phone and whispered, "You're welcome." The room felt quiet, but not empty. Peace has a sound. It's soft, steady, and honest. I looked around the house, my house, and realized every corner had changed. Not because I redecorated, but because I finally belonged here. The walls didn't echo betrayal anymore. They held stories of survival. And in that silence, I heard laughter again. Not his, mine. People say karma takes time. They're wrong. Karma takes courage. And sometimes, it takes one woman brave enough to stop cleaning up everyone else's mess. That's what I did. And maybe, just maybe, that's what I was meant to do all along. They say every echo begins with a noise. Mine started with a scream behind a locked door. But weeks later, it had become a chorus, one I never asked to lead. By the time national TV picked up my story, I had already stopped checking the numbers. Claire called me one morning, voice trembling with disbelief. "Elena, you're trending in 3 countries." I laughed. Imagine that, a housewife from a quiet town, trending for glue. The headline was everywhere. The woman who got stuck with karma. Some news anchors treated it like a joke. Others called it a modern fable. And a few, mostly women, called it bravery. I didn't correct any of them. Because for once, the world was arguing about my story, not ignoring it. Then came him. Mark. My husband, or what was left of that title. A clip appeared online. An interview. He sat in a stiff chair, wearing a new shirt and a fake humility. The background was gray, the kind they use for serious news. The interviewer spoke softly, like she was comforting a victim. "Mark," she said, "what was going through your mind that night?" He sighed dramatically. "I was ashamed. Betrayed by someone I trusted. I remember laughing out loud. Betrayed." He said it like he was the one who'd been glued. The interviewer nodded sympathetically. "Do you still love your wife?" He paused, looking down like a man rehearsing sincerity. "I'll always love her. She just lost her way." That was the line that broke the internet. Comments exploded. Half the viewers defended him, the other half destroyed him. Someone wrote, "She didn't lose her way, she found hers." Another said, "Men cheat, lie, destroy families, then cry on TV for sympathy. Classic." Claire texted me again. "You need to respond," she said. "Everyone's waiting for your reaction." I typed 2 words. "I won't." Because silence is louder when you've already said everything. But the internet doesn't handle silence well. They want noise, drama, apologies. And I gave them none. Instead, I went back to my garden, planted rosemary, lavender, thyme, things that grow back stronger when trimmed. And every morning, as the world argued about me, I watered peace. A week later, a talk show host invited me. Big network, bright lights. They offered money, fame, control. "Tell your story your way," they said. But I didn't want control anymore. I wanted quiet. So I said no. They still ran the segment, of course. 3 experts debating whether I was mentally unstable or emotionally liberated. Men analyzing my morality like a lab experiment. Women debating if my act was justice or crime. I watched 5 minutes, then turned it off. Because no one on that screen had ever woken up to betrayal breathing beside them. The next morning, I went for coffee downtown. The barista, a young woman with pink hair, recognized me instantly. She leaned over and whispered, "My mom left my dad after watching your interview." She said, "If Elena can do it, so can I." I didn't know whether to cry or smile. So I did both. Because healing has no rule book. Later that week, I passed by the old community board near the church. Someone had pinned a flyer that said, "Women's Support Meeting, Healing, Not Hiding." Underneath, written in pen, was a note. Inspired by the glue lady. I stood there for a long time, reading the words over and over. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't the echo. I was the start. Mark's interview didn't end well for him. A few days after it aired, another video surfaced, an old recording. Eliza, tear-streaked, angry, shouting into her phone, He told me he'd leave his wife. He lied. The internet tore him apart after that. Headlines flipped overnight. The truth about Mark Lane. Suddenly, he wasn't a victim anymore. He was the villain again. And I didn't have to say a single word. Adam came over that evening with takeout. He dropped the food on the counter and said, "You've seen the videos, right?" "I have." He looked uneasy. "Does it bother you?" "No," I said. "Karma's just doing quality control." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're unbelievable." "I was," I said. "Now I'm unbreakable." The days that followed felt lighter. I'd stopped checking social media, stopped reading articles, stopped explaining myself, because I didn't need to prove I was right. He'd done that for me. One night, I got another letter. No name again. Just handwriting I recognized, slightly shakier this time. "You win. I've lost everything. I hope you're happy." I folded it neatly and set it aside. Happiness wasn't the right word. Peace was. Because happiness is fleeting. Peace is permanent. Sometimes, I catch myself replaying it. Not the scandal, not the screaming, but the silence after. That moment when the sirens faded, and I realized I didn't have to be the victim anymore. That was the real turning point. Not the glue, not the cameras. Just stillness. Months passed. The noise dimmed. The hashtags disappeared. But every now and then, a stranger would still stop me on the street. Not to gossip, to thank me. And every time, I'd tell them the same thing. "Don't thank me. Just don't forget yourself next time." Because that's all I did. I remembered who I was. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about preservation. Of dignity. Of silence. Of the kind of peace you can only earn by walking through fire and coming out without the smell of smoke. So when people ask me, "How did you survive the noise?" I smile and say, "I stopped listening." Because the echo can only last as long as you feed it. And I was finally done feeding pain. That night, as I turned off the lights, I looked around my quiet house one last time. No cameras. No questions. No ghosts. Just me. And the peace I built from the ruins. I whispered into the still air. Some stories end with forgiveness. Mine ends with freedom. And this time, even the silence applauded. I thought I'd never hear from him again. After the interviews, after the headlines, after all the noise, Mark simply vanished. No calls, no letters, no apologies. For months, I lived like he'd never existed. I woke up, made my coffee, opened my windows to the sunlight, and realized that peace isn't quiet because nothing happens. Peace is quiet because nothing hurts anymore. But Karma, she's thorough. She doesn't forget anyone. Not even the ones who think they can run from her. One morning, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something in me, curiosity, maybe pity, picked it up anyway. "Elena?" The voice was raspy, fragile. For a moment, I didn't recognize it. Then I did. "Mark." There was silence on the line, heavy like wet paper. Finally, he said, I didn't know who else to call." He sounded different. Not angry, not proud, just small. The kind of small that comes when a man finally realizes no one's coming to rescue him. "I lost the house," he said. "The job too. They won't let me near the clinic anymore after the story." He paused, waiting for sympathy. I gave him none. "Eliza?" I asked. He exhaled, like the name itself hurt. "She left, moved away. She said she couldn't live with the shame." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Shame's funny," I said. "You never notice it until it's public." He sighed head. "I know you hate me." "I don't," I said honestly. "I outgrew that." That threw him off. He didn't know what to do with calm. He only knew how to fight storms, not silence. "Elena, please," he whispered. "I need help. Just something to start over." He sounded desperate. The kind of desperate that used to make me cave. But not anymore. "Start over?" I repeated. "You mean pretend it didn't happen?" He didn't answer. Men like him rarely do when faced with the truth. "You had your start," I said softly. "It just ended with glue instead of grace." He tried to laugh, but it cracked halfway. "I messed up," he said. "I was stupid. I was lonely." "Lonely?" I repeated. "You had a wife, a son, a family." He was quiet again. Guilt has its own silence. It hums louder than words. Finally, he said, "Can we meet?" "No," I said. You won't even talk to me face to face? I already did once. You just weren't listening. He tried one last time. Elena, please. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a second chance. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. You already had one. You spent it in her room. Then I hung up. I expected to feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was lighter, like letting go of a heavy coat I'd worn through summer. It wasn't victory. It was release. Later that day, Claire texted again. She'd seen Mark's fall from grace splashed across the tabloids. Do you want to comment? She asked. No, I replied. Let him narrate his own downfall. By evening, social media had turned the story into a morality play. Cheating husband loses everything. Glue lady's karma strikes again. People called it poetic justice, but I didn't see it that way. It wasn't poetry anymore. It was just consequence finally catching up. A week later, I saw him. Not on purpose. I was at the grocery store, aisle 6, staring at a row of cleaning supplies. I turned, and there he was. Mark. Thinner. Paler. Older than I remembered. He froze when he saw me. For a moment, we both just stood there, surrounded by detergent and paper towels. I couldn't help but laugh inside. Of all places to meet the cleaning aisle. He tried to smile. You look good. I am good. He looked down, embarrassed. You deserve it. I raised an eyebrow. You finally learned what I deserve? He nodded weakly. I learned what I lost. That was the first honest thing he'd said in years. He followed me to the checkout. Not close, just enough to make the air heavy. When I paid, he said softly, You know, I think about that night every day. I turned, calm as ever. Good, I said. Maybe that's what accountability feels like. He blinked, like he didn't understand the word. And maybe he never would. Then, as I picked up my bag, I looked him in the eye and said, You wanted me stuck to your life. Now you're the one who can't let go. And I walked away. That night, I sat by my kitchen window with a glass of wine. I didn't think about him. I thought about me. About the woman who once whispered apologies into pillows. About the one who waited for loyalty that never came. About the one who finally stopped waiting. I realized something then. Revenge isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's silence so steady, it echoes. The next morning, I wrote in my journal, He fell. I didn't push. I just stopped holding him up. And that's the truth most people miss. When you stop saving the wrong person, you finally start saving yourself. A few days later, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't from Mark. It was from Eliza. Her handwriting was smaller, careful, like she was afraid the paper would bite back. I know you'll never forgive me. You shouldn't. But I wanted you to know I left him. For good. I'm pregnant. And I'm naming the baby Grace. Because that's what you showed me even when I didn't deserve it. I sat there for a long time. Not angry. Not sad. Just still. Because sometimes the best revenge is when they learn what you already knew. You were never the problem. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Then I whispered, Good luck, Grace. And as the morning light filled the kitchen, I smiled, not the smile of victory, but of peace that's finally done pretending. Because karma wasn't about payback anymore. It was about balance. And for the first time in years, everything felt even. Time moves differently when you're at peace. Days don't drag anymore. They drift soft, slow, kind. It had been almost a year since that night. Since the sirens, the glue, the chaos. My house no longer smelled like memory. It smelled like rosemary and fresh coffee. Most mornings, I'd sit by the window, reading letters from women I'd never met. They still came 1, 2, sometimes a dozen each week. Stories of betrayal, of silence, of finally walking away. It amazed me how pain could travel continents and still find its way back to my front door. One afternoon, as I watered the plants, my phone buzzed. A name I didn't recognize. The message was simple. Miss Lane, we're hosting a national conference on forgiveness and healing. We'd be honored if you shared your story. I almost laughed. Me, the woman who turned massage oil into a cautionary tale, asked to speak about forgiveness. At first, I deleted the message. But it stayed in my mind like a splinter. Because maybe, after everything, forgiveness was all that was left to talk about. Not the kind that frees them. The kind that frees you. A week later, I called the organizer back. Her voice was warm, gentle, like someone used to calming storms. Elena, your story changed people, she said. It's time they see the woman behind it. I agreed. Not because I wanted attention, but because maybe it was time to close the book properly. The event was held in Chicago, a quiet auditorium lined with white flowers and low light. There were hundreds of people there, mostly women. Some came alone, others held hands. You could feel it in the air, the weight of untold stories waiting to exhale. Backstage, I looked at myself in the mirror. No longer the furious wife. Not the glue lady. Just me, steady, clear-eyed, softer somehow. The host approached. "When you're ready," she said. I smiled. I've been ready my whole life. The stage lights were bright. I could barely see the audience, but I could feel them, that silent, collective heartbeat. I began the way I always do. Calm, honest, real. "I'm not proud of what I did," I said, "but I'm not ashamed either. Sometimes, survival looks like something you can't explain until you've been there." The room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that demands attention, but the kind that listens. I told them about the betrayal, the silence, the night that changed everything. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't justify it. I just told the truth. Then I paused and said the line I hadn't planned to say. "Forgiveness," he began, "isn't letting them off the hook. It's letting yourself stop holding the rope." You could hear the air shift. Someone in the front row gasped softly. Another started to cry. "We spend so much time trying to make sense of people who hurt us," I continued, "that we forget to protect the parts of ourselves that still believe in love. Forgiveness isn't about saying, 'It's okay.' It's about saying, 'It's over.'" After the talk, there was a Q&A. A woman stood up, maybe mid-40s, wearing a pale yellow sweater. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. "Did you ever forgive him?" she asked. I smiled, because I knew everyone was waiting for that question. They always are. "No," I said softly. "I didn't forgive him. I forgave myself for staying too long, for believing too much, for mistaking comfort for love." The room was still. No applause yet. Just silence, the kind that feels sacred. Then, slowly, they started to clap. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but the soft, steady rhythm of people who understood. After the event, women lined up to hug me. Some cried. Some just whispered, "Thank you." One woman, older, gray hair tucked behind her ears, said, "You gave us permission to stop pretending we're okay." I smiled. Maybe that's the closest thing to forgiveness we'll ever need. When I returned home, the sun was setting behind the trees. I sat on the porch, watching light turn gold to amber. The house was quiet, but not empty. It felt lived in, whole. My phone buzzed again, another message. Unknown number. Just one line. "I watched your speech. I hope you're proud of yourself." No name, but I didn't need one. I knew that voice, even in text. "Mark." I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back, "I'm not proud. I'm at peace." He didn't reply, and I didn't need him to. Because peace doesn't need validation. It just needs distance. That night, I went through the drawer where I'd kept all the letters. Elisa's. Mark's. Even the first one I wrote to myself. Then I took them outside, lit a small fire in the garden, and fed each letter to the flame, one by one. The paper curled, the ink dissolved, and all that was left was smoke rising quietly into the night. I whispered to the dark, "I forgive the past for existing. I just don't live there anymore." When the last letter turned to ash, I felt something lift, like my story had finally caught up with my peace. I walked back inside, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the stars come out one by one. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just the woman who glued her cheating husband to his karma. I was the woman who set herself free. Peace has a strange way of finding you. Not in the grand moments, but in the quiet ones that almost go unnoticed. It had been months since the conference. The noise had faded. The interviews stopped. Even the gossip blogs had moved on to newer scandals. And for the first time in my life, silence didn't scare me. It felt like company, like the sound of myself breathing without apology. One morning, a package arrived at my doorstep. No return address. Just my name, Mrs. Elena Lane, written in delicate handwriting. I almost didn't open it. I'd promised myself I was done with surprises, but something about the neat ribbon tied around the box made me pause. Inside was a small, hand-knitted baby blanket, pale lavender. Underneath it, a note. "She was born healthy. Her name is Grace. just like I promised. She has your calm eyes. Thank you for letting me start over. Elisa. I sat down right there on the floor, the blanket soft against my fingertips. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. Joy, sadness, relief, maybe all of them at once. Eliza had kept her word. She'd named her daughter Grace, the one thing we both needed, even if it came from opposite sides of betrayal. I imagined the child, tiny fingers, steady breath, unaware of the history that brought her into this world. Maybe that was the point. Grace didn't need to carry the past. She was the proof that something good could still grow from it. I folded the blanket gently, then placed it on my favorite chair by the window. The morning light poured over it like a blessing. For the first time, I whispered the name out loud, Grace. And it didn't sting. It didn't echo pain. It just sounded right. Later that week, a letter followed. Elisa again. This time, longer. More honest. I think about you often, about the things I did, and how much strength it must have taken not to destroy me completely. I used to think revenge meant winning. Now I think it means surviving long enough to learn peace. Grace's father isn't in her life. He tried to reach out, but I refused. Some doors should stay closed. I read it twice, then smiled. Not because I forgave her, but because she'd learned the one thing I'd wanted both of them to understand, that actions echo longer than guilt. A few days later, I drove into town. Stopped by the same small cafe where I'd once met Claire, the reporter. She spotted me from across the room, waved, and said, Elena Lane, the quiet legend. I laughed. I prefer Gardner. Over coffee, she asked, do you ever think about seeing Eliza again? Not really, I said. Some stories are better when they end where they should. Besides, I don't need to see her to know she's trying. Claire nodded. You know they still use your speech in women's workshops. I know, I said. I get tagged in videos sometimes. It's strange, isn't it? How something born out of betrayal turned into hope for strangers. She smiled. Maybe that's your real revenge, turning pain into purpose. That night, I dreamed of Grace. She was running through a field, small, barefoot, her laughter carried by the wind. And somewhere far behind, I saw Eliza watching. Not with guilt, but with gratitude. When I woke, I couldn't shake the image. So I wrote it down in my journal. Maybe every sin plants a seed. We don't get to choose what grows. But sometimes, the garden surprises you. The next morning, I received another envelope. This one was different, official looking. It was from a local charity foundation. They'd seen my interview and wanted to collaborate on a mentorship program for women leaving toxic marriages. They even had a name for it already. Project Grace. I laughed out loud. Not at the irony, at the poetry of it all. The same word that once meant forgiveness was now building futures. A month later, I stood on a small stage again. But this time, there were no cameras, no bright lights, no speeches rehearsed. Just 10 women sitting in a circle, each holding a story heavy enough to drown in. I started simply, you don't have to be unbroken to begin again. They listened, really listened. And in their eyes, I saw something familiar, that quiet fire of women who've stopped apologizing for surviving. That was the day I realized I hadn't just healed, I'd become the bridge for others to cross. When the meeting ended, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 23. Her voice trembled as she said, my mom followed your story last year. She said you made her brave enough to leave. I just wanted to say, thank you. I smiled. What's your name? She hesitated, then whispered, Grace. My heart stopped for a second. Not because it could be her, but because it was her, in some way. Every Grace who'd ever been born from pain, every woman who decided to live instead of linger. I took her hand. Grace, I said softly, you're exactly where you're meant to be. That night, as I walked home under the soft streetlights, I felt the world turn quietly beneath my feet. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I realized revenge had never been my story's ending. It was just the spark that started something bigger, something cleaner, something real. At home, I sat by the window again, the lavender blanket still folded on the chair. Outside, the wind carried faint laughter from somewhere far away. I whispered, maybe karma and grace aren't opposites. Maybe they're sisters. One teaches you the lesson, the other helps you live with it. And with that thought, I finally closed my journal. because my story wasn't unfinished anymore. It was complete. It's strange how stories outlive the people who lived them. I used to think my life ended the night everything fell apart. But now, when I look around, I see pieces of that night blooming everywhere, in every woman who found her voice, in every letter that begins with, "Because of you." What started as revenge had turned into something else entirely. A legacy. Project Grace grew faster than I expected. At first, it was just a small group, 10 women meeting in a borrowed church basement. But within months, there were hundreds. Then, thousands. They came from everywhere, small towns, big cities, places I'd never heard of. Each one carrying her own story of betrayal, silence, and finally, awakening. We didn't talk about pain as much as we talked about power, because pain was the past. Power was what came next. Claire, the reporter, became one of our biggest supporters. She filmed our meetings, collected testimonies, and one day said, "Elena, this isn't just a support group. It's a movement." I smiled. "Movements are messy. I just wanted healing." She laughed. "Sometimes healing is the movement." One morning, I received a letter with government seals on it. For a moment, my heart jumped old instincts. But it wasn't bad news. It was an invitation. A women's foundation wanted to honor Project Grace with an award for empowerment through storytelling. I almost said no. I wasn't the kind of woman who belonged on stages and podiums. But then I thought, maybe someone in that audience still needed to see what survival looks like. So I said yes. The ceremony was small, elegant, and quiet. Exactly how I like things now. When they called my name, I walked to the stage, feeling the weight of 1,000 stories walking with me. The host handed me a glass plaque and said, "You turned pain into purpose." I smiled. "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending pain couldn't speak." The audience stood, not for the speech, for the silence that followed it. Because sometimes, silence says everything. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned, I saw a familiar face standing near the exit. Tall, hesitant, with the same eyes that once looked at me full of confusion and hurt. Adam, my son. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. We'd spoken, of course, short calls, polite updates, but distance had lived between us, like a quiet ghost. He smiled softly. "Hi, Mom." I froze for a second, then hugged him. Tight. When we sat down, he looked older. Calmer. Wiser in the way people become after losing illusions. "I've been following Project Grace," he said. "I wanted to come sooner, but I didn't know how." "It's okay," I said. "Some wounds need silence before they can speak." He nodded, eyes down. Then, quietly, I watched everything back then. The news, the interviews. I didn't know who to believe. I reached for his hand. "You didn't have to believe anyone," I said. "You just had to heal." He hesitated, then said the words I never expected to hear. "Dad reached out. He's sick." My heart didn't break. It just shifted. Like an old door opening on a hinge I thought was rusted shut. "He asked if I'd tell you," Adam continued. "He wanted to see you. Just once." I took a breath. Steady. "And what did you say?" I told him I'd ask you. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of seeing Mark again brought back memories I thought had long since lost their edges. The betrayal, the humiliation, the noise, but also the silence that followed, the calm that rebuilt me. I asked myself what I would even say if I saw him. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. 2 weeks later, I went. Not out of guilt, but because closure doesn't always come to find you. Sometimes you have to go meet it halfway. He was in a small care facility outside town. When I walked into the room, he looked smaller than I remembered. Older, like time had finally caught up. "Elena," he whispered. His voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I said. He smiled faintly. "You look peaceful." "I am." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I wish I'd known how to give you that." For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger, only distance. The kind that protects, not punishes. "I heard about Project Grace," he said softly. "I guess you turned me into a lesson." I smiled. "No, Mark, you turned yourself into one. I just told the story." He laughed weakly. "I deserved that." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I'm sorry." I believed him. Maybe because I finally didn't need the apology. "I forgive you," I said quietly. But not for you. He looked confused. For me? When I stood to leave, he reached for my hand. Do you ever think about what we had? I looked at him, calm. What we had was real, until it wasn't. And that's enough. I turned to go. He called after me. Thank you for coming. I didn't answer, because some goodbyes are best left as whispers. Outside, the air smelled like rain. I tilted my face up to the sky and let it fall. Not cold, not cleansing, just real. As I walked back to the car, I realized something beautiful. I had walked into that place carrying the weight of the past. I walked out lighter than I'd ever been. That night, Adam called. How did it go? It's over, I said. He was quiet for a while. Then, I'm proud of you, Mom. I smiled. I'm proud of me too. When I hung up, I looked around the living room. The lavender blanket was still on the chair, the award on the shelf, the plants blooming quietly near the window. Everything that once reminded me of pain now looked like proof of survival. I whispered, this is what legacy looks like. Not fame, not forgiveness, just peace that multiplies. And as the rain tapped gently on the window, I realized I didn't need to write another chapter. My story had already outgrown me, because every time a woman says, I deserve better, a little piece of my story keeps living. And that's the only immortality I'll ever need. They say every story has an ending, but I've learned that some stories don't end. They evolve. It's been 2 years now since that night. 2 years since the sound of sirens. Since the glue. Since the version of me that thought revenge was the only way to breathe again. When I look back now, I barely recognize that woman. She was shaking, angry, desperate to be heard. But she was also brave, because even when her heart broke, she refused to disappear quietly. And maybe that's the real story. Not the scandal, not the chaos, but the woman who came out on the other side. These days, my mornings are simple. Coffee, sunlight, a little music from the old radio by the window. Sometimes, I forget how loud my life used to be, how full of noise and guilt and pretending. Now it's soft, like the world finally exhaled with me. The lavender blanket still sits on the chair. I never moved it. It's not a reminder of pain anymore. It's a symbol of what came after. Grace. Last week, Project Grace celebrated its 2nd anniversary. Hundreds of women gathered in a hall filled with flowers and light. Some came to thank me, but I knew the truth. They didn't come for me. They came for themselves. During the event, a young woman stood up and said, "Your story gave us permission to stop being the background character in our own lives." I smiled, because that was exactly what I'd been. The supporting role in a life that should have been mine. Not anymore. After the ceremony, I walked outside into the garden. There were candles everywhere, each one lit by a woman who'd survived something. They flickered like stars scattered across the earth. I stood there for a while, watching the flames dance in the breeze, and I whispered the same words I'd said the night it all began. Sometimes people get too close for their own good. But this time, it wasn't about anger. It was about understanding. Mark passed away quietly a few months later. Adam told me over the phone, calm, respectful, not broken. He was at peace, he said, and I believed him. Because by then, I was too. I didn't go to the funeral, not out of hatred, but because I'd already buried everything that needed to die. Instead, I planted another rosemary bush in the garden. Something that smelled alive, something that grew back stronger each time it was cut. That was my goodbye. One morning, I received another package. Inside was a small photo frame, a baby girl smiling at the camera, tiny hands clutching a lavender blanket. The note said simply, "Grace just turned 1. She's happy. Thank you for not letting the past define her future." I held the photo for a long time. Tears came not from sadness, but from gratitude. Because even if the world remembered me as the glue lady, that child would never know the story behind her name. She'd grow up surrounded by love, and that was enough. I walked outside again, barefoot on the cool grass. The air smelled of rain and rosemary. Somewhere, a neighbor's wind chimes sang quietly, and I thought about how everything, the anger, the heartbreak, the chaos, had led me right here, to peace. People think revenge is loud, but peace is louder, because peace doesn't have to prove anything. Later that evening, I sat by the window and began to write again. Not in a journal this time, but a letter, not to Mark, not to Eliza, but to the woman I used to be. You did what you had to do to survive. You fought the wrong way, maybe, but you fought. And because of you, hundreds of women learned how to save themselves. You were never weak. You were just waiting to remember your strength. I folded the letter, placed it under the lavender blanket, and whispered, "Rest now," because she finally could. The next morning, as the sun rose over the garden, I made a cup of tea and watched the light spill across the floor. And I realized something. This was the ending. Not dramatic, not loud, just peaceful. I didn't get revenge. I got freedom. And freedom, that's the kind of ending you don't need to explain. So, if you're still watching this, if you've stayed with me through every confession, every twist, every quiet moment, then maybe this isn't just my story anymore. Maybe it's ours. Because every woman who's ever been lied to, every heart that's ever broken, every soul that's ever whispered, "I deserve better," you've already lived a version of this story. And if you haven't reached your ending yet, trust me, it's coming. It just won't look the way you expect. It'll be softer, stronger, yours. If you felt this story, don't scroll yet. Subscribe for more true family revenge stories, the kind that start with heartbreak but end with power. Because sometimes the best revenge is finally being free. Number, family revenge story. Number, cheating stories, story time.